I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share my work with you. This is my first time to make a presentation on methodology, so I'm nervous and anxious. We all have emotions, both in everyday life and a special situation like this. This is especially the case during protests and social movements, because when people are striving for social change, they are very often highly emotional. So today I'm going to use my project on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong as an illustration to talk about how the method of walking interviews can help to decipher activists' emotional experience in a protest space. In the existing literature of social movement studies, multiple methods have been applied to understand people's emotions and understand the impacts of emotion in social movements. The most popular methods are interviews and participant observation, but these methods by themselves are inadequate in helping us to understand emotions. In participant observations, informants usually do not comment on what's going on when they're acting in a natural setting. So it's often difficult to know how the informants themselves interpret and articulate their own emotional experience. Interviews may help in this regard, but the traditional sit-down interview tend to dissociate interviewees' emotional narrative from where they experience their emotions. So without a specific context, it's often difficult to grasp the nuances of how and why an emotion arises. So the walking interview is a method to combine the features of participant observations and sit-down interviews while trying to avoid their limitations. In a walking interview, a researcher goes along with one or more research participants to walk through a place that the participant had engaged in or is engaging in. The aim of this is to connect what the interviewees say with where they say it, so that we can know more about the interviewees' interpretation and articulation of their own emotional experience, and also their attitudes and knowledge about that place. By placing interviewees in a specific spatial context, we can also observe how the interviewees interact with the physical and social settings, and we can follow their stream of experience, emotions, and practice in relation to that context as they walk through a place. So I apply the walking interviews to understand activists' emotional experience in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And I try to understand how emotions were shaped by a protest space and how emotions affect the movement in Hong Kong. So in practical terms, the use of walking interview also helped me to address two problems. My project investigates 4 movement campaigns, and all of them occurred in the past. That means participant observation was no longer an option for me. But by using walking interview, I can recontextualize the observations, albeit in a former contentious space that had undergone significant changes. Secondly, since my data collection was done in 2017 and 2018, that means the interviewees were likely to have difficulty in recalling their memory. So the walking interview is a good way to retrieve the interviewees' emotional experience and by situating them back into a protest space. So I first did a pilot walking interview with my friend who was also an activist, and then recruit former activists through snowball sampling. In deciding where to visit, scholars have suggested that researchers can either decide a fixed route for the interview or let the participant to decide where they want to go. I chose the latter approach because it was quite impossible for me to say in advance which places were more emotional for the activists and which places were less significant. So when I contacted the interviewees, I explained to them what my research was about and then gave them just one simple instruction. Can you bring me to a site which was significant to you during the campaign and talk about your experience there? If they asked for clarification, I would just twist my instruction a bit by saying, you might have some important memory during the campaign. Can you bring me to that site and then and share your experience with me? I received 2 types of responses, and this dictates the flow of the walk interview and the order of questions. 2 activists gave me a list of places they would like to visit and talk about. Both of them include the old Legislative Council building in Hong Kong in their list. That is the picture on the top. It was a place where many protests were held. So based on my pre-existing knowledge about the protests being held in the places being proposed, and also the campaigns being held there, I prepared a list of questions regarding the major actions taking place in these places, which were possibly emotionally significant to the activists. This question assured that my basic concern about emotions and space will be discussed during the interview. But during the interview, I stuck with the open-ended approach to let the interviewees to articulate their emotional experience as freely as possible, as well as the question about why did they participate, how did they feel, and what did they do. So the flow of the interview was largely dictated by what the interviewee says as they walk through a place. The question I had prepared would only be asked if the core topics were not touched upon. And since we need to visit multiple places, it involves some traveling in between these sites. So I prepared some general questions regarding the protest so that I could make good use of the time to get a broader picture about the interviewees' participation as well as their general views regarding the protest. The walk interview I did with the other 3 activists went the other way around, and it went from general to specific. Since the 3 activists did not propose any specific site to visit, so I suggest a place without predetermining a fixed route for the interview. The place I proposed was the area around the Hong Kong government headquarters. That is the picture in the bottom. It was chosen because two of my cases occur around this complex, which involves spatial occupations and countless confrontation with the police. So I expect that this site will shape some of the most important emotional experience for the activists. Another reason for me to choose this site is that since the 3 activists had all taken part in the 2 campaigns being held in this place, so I expect that they could at least come up with some ideas about the specific site they would like to visit, or at least have some interesting thing to share with me if they revisit the site. So when I first met the activists near the Hong Kong government headquarters, I asked them again whether they had any idea about where to go. One of them did think of a few places when he was prompted by that particular spatial context. For the other 2 activists, we began by wandering around the Hong Kong government headquarters. While we were walking, I asked them some general questions regarding the protests and their participations. This conversation allowed me to get an idea about what they mainly did during the campaign. If they highlight some specific action that sound remarkable to them in their protest experience, I would suggest to go to that site and ask more specific questions about those actions in that site. By placing interviews in a specific spatial context, I found that walk interviews can help to understand emotional experience in 4 different ways. Firstly, during the walk-along process, the spatial environment can become a cue for interviewees to evoke and recall emotional events. That means emotional narrative could surface when the interviewee go back to a particular spatial context and when he or she was prompted by that particular space. This could be explained by the interview I did with Jack. Jack was an interviewee who did not decide a place to go in advance, but then came up with some ideas when we met. When we first met at the train station near the Hong Kong government headquarters, he suddenly pointed to the stair right in front of the station exit. And then he told me a joyful but angry experience in a pro-democracy campaign called the Umbrella Movement in 2014. During the movement, the protesters were very often intimidated by some conservative pro-government groups. This intimidation ranged from verbal abuse to physical attacks. So the protesters invented a humorous way to fend off this disturbance by singing the song "Happy Birthday to You" to these pro-government supporters. Jack recalled a day when the protesters knew that a pro-government group was coming, so 40 to 50 protesters gathered at the stair and they tried to make some fun. They start practicing the song "Happy Birthday to You" like a choir and prepare to sing to that group once they exit from the station. But when they arrived, the atmosphere immediately turned tense, and everyone was saying foul language to swear at that group. This story illustrates how positive and negative emotions were paired in the same space, and how the rhythm of emotions change during political actions. And it is through a spatial cue, no matter how ordinary it is, that such emotional event could be recalled and expressed. Another example comes from my interview with Kenny. Kenny was the interviewee who had proposed some places to go before the interview. The first place we visited was a crossroad in the BC district. It was another protest zone of the Umbrella Movement in 2014. Kenny chose this area because he initially wanted to highlight how he spent his time there and wrote about the campaign as a writer. But interestingly, one of the very first things he told me was his experience of witnessing a group of pro-government gangsters who carried knives to attack the protesters. And then he told me the sense of fear he experienced on that day and how this discouraged his further involvement in that area. This story suggests that emotional experience could be subtle to the activists, which might not even be aware of by themselves. But once prompted by the spatial prop during the walk interview, they could be recalled and then expressed as a narrative. The second way walk interview might help to elicit data about emotions is that it can enable interviewees to draw on the physical environment as a prop to articulate their emotional narrative. My walk interview with Jason is telling here. Jason was another interviewee who had proposed some places to go before the interview. The first place he brought me to was the Victoria Park in Hong Kong. While walking in the park, Jason brought my attention to a church located right next to the park and told me a story about how he was moved during his first political participation in the annual June 4th commemoration held in this park. This event was organized to commemorate the Tiananmen massacre in mainland China in 1989. As a Christian, Jason said, when he was participating in that political gathering and saw the word Jesus is Lord hung on that building, which I circled in yellow in the picture, he immediately applied what he learned about justice from the Bible and understand the mass killing in China and shed tears during the event. So we can see how interviewees articulate their emotional experience through using physical objects in a spatial environment as a prop. Through this prop, we can understand how the emotional story could be told to communicate with the researcher during a walk interview. And we can also know more about what meanings are invested by the interviewees into this object and how the interviewee's emotions are related to the meaning of these objects. But even if a physical object does not exist anymore, it can still be recalled and expressed, especially when they go back to a particular place and was prompted by that particular setting. The picture on your left was the protest camp during the umbrella movement in 2014. And the one on your right was taken during my walk interview with Jack in 2017. When we were walking on the bridge, Jack could immediately identify the location of his tent at that time, which was next to the tree and the road sign. He told me at that time he hung a balloon with a smiling face on his tent. Because his tent was so special, it became a place where people like to stop over, take a photo, and share a sense of joyfulness. This little story indicates that even though an object had disappeared, the associated spatial environment, such as the tree and the road sign in Jack's case, could still serve as a prop for emotional. The associated spatial environment can still prompt emotional story to be retrieved through the associated spatial setting. So the walk interview is useful in leaving this story to surface and then be told to the researcher. So far I've discussed how a walk interview can help to elicit emotional narrative by placing an interview in space. But the usefulness of walk interview is far more than that. Through walking and talking, the interview provides a way for activists not just to talk about emotions in place, but also talk emotionally in place. When Jack was talking with me in front of the main gate of the government headquarters, a police car passed us coincidentally. At that moment, Jack paused talking, and then he stared at the police car until it disappeared, and showed a face of contempt. A few seconds later, he said to himself, "Today is the day after the Chinese National Day. How come there are still so many police around?" He then explained to me, after having confronted with the police during the umbrella movement, he has become very sensitive and very angry to the presence of the police. Having observed Jack's reactions and listened to his explanations, I immediately realized and understood activist hatred toward the police. This emotion grew of police violence during the umbrella movement in 2014, and it lasts until today. While this kind of reaction can hardly come up in a traditional sit-down interview, it can suddenly pop up in a walk interview through sudden spatial encounters. This offers a chance for us not just to hear verbal narrative, but also observe emotions in bodily terms during a conversation. An additional advantage of walk interview is that it can make the physical environment an explicit topic of conversation, providing a way for us to interpret the socio-spatial context of emotions. In the interview I did with Nick, we began by chatting about some general issues about social movement when we were walking around the Hong Kong government headquarters. I asked him how he thought about the effectiveness of organizing protests in this space. When explaining the difficulties in building up momentum in such a large area, Nick suddenly recalled an incident during which the government suddenly turned off all the street lights in one evening of the umbrella movement. This incident created a fearful night because the military headquarters, that is the white building with a red star that I circled in yellow, is located just right next to the protest site. So everyone feared that the army might just come and repress the protest violently. The incident described by Nick illustrates the concentration of power in Hong Kong and the way this power is manifested spatially to pose a constant threat to the protesters and shape their emotions. This shows the utility of walking the field in teasing out the spatial context of emotions. So in the final few minutes, I would like to highlight several practical stuff related to walking in the fields. The 5 walking in the field I did last for 2.5 to 3 hours, so the amount of time required for a walk in the field is almost a double of a traditional sit-down interview. So even if the interviewee and I sometimes stop and chat, the journeys were quite energy consuming, partly because summer in Hong Kong is quite hot. So I do not recommend having a very long walk in the field because it may be counterproductive and exhausting. And of course, it's always important to consider the weather condition. But if your research topic is about everyday life and urban space, it may not be a bad idea to conduct a walk in the field during bad weather because you'll be able to see how people use their urban space in a rainy or stormy day in their daily life. During the interview, I just carried an A5 sized paper that contains some questions I prepared to ask. I did not take any notes during the interview because writing while walking could be very troublesome. Yeah. I rely on my memory to remember the route I had walked through, and then when I was transcribing the interview, I used Google Maps to trace the route and then identify the locations of where the conversations took place. Some scholars use GPS to check the route of their walk interviews, but I did not apply this method, partly because the topic I'm working on was quite sensitive. So I did not want to make my interviewees to feel worried about their privacy and safety. Another issue is the use of video to record the journeys. Again, this may raise the issue of privacy, and another concern is the intrusive nature of a camera on the conversation. So I didn't take any video during the journey. Instead, I used photo as a way of recording. During the journey, I took some photos of the places the interviewees and I had visited and discussed. Then I insert this photo into my transcript as a visual record to assist my analysis. As for the audio record, I used a voice recorder with a clip just like this, so that the interviewee could wear the recorder on their shirt or just put it into their pocket. To assure that my voice was also recorded, I also used my phone as the second recorder, so that even if the street is too noisy and the wearable recorder could not record my voice, I can still match the audio track of both devices and get a full transcript. But it turned out that the quality of the wearable recorder was quite good, that it could record both the voice of the interviewees and me. So my final point to make is, like the traditional sit-down interview, having a good voice recorder is the key to a successful walking interview.